Welcome to the Jeff and Alex podcast. I am Jeff Hillemeyer, and with my friend Alex Gonzalez, we explore topics that help you be your best self. And we also get to chat with some great guests. So join us now on the Jeff and Alex podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Jeff and Alex podcast. And once again, we're hidden away in our respective studios early on a Saturday morning. And Jeff Hillemeyer, good morning. I am tired because I was up past midnight, hoping that our Atlanta Braves, and just to reveal for all those, I know this is dropping. Hopefully when this is dropping, we will be in the World Series. But watching our Atlanta Braves drop game 5, I guess, of the NLCS. So how are you, Jeff?
I'm good. I'm tired for different reasons. I'm tired because of the 5 children that live in my house with me. But
when they get older, you can just start ignoring them, by the way.
There you go. Yeah.
They'll ignore
right.
you. So,
but no, happy to be chatting with you early on a Saturday. I love these sessions.
Yeah, this is great. And this is, as you know, a huge, just a busy month for different reasons. And I'm excited about this week coming up. Which is kind of the peak of this kind of innovation season in Atlanta. And so remind people, if you have not, if you go a couple episodes back, you'll Jeff and I talk pretty extensively about the tech and innovation season that we're within as this episode drops. So it's kind of like your Grammy preview show. So, just learn about everything you want for your season. And perhaps afterwards, we'll talk a little bit about, what we've also learned and observed. So and hopefully we'll talk about that, and hopefully we'll be talking about the Braves also being the World Series. But so what's on your mind, Jeff? What's going on?
It's interesting. I've been thinking a lot about old mentors and the people who've helped me along the way. Part of it was triggered by a couple of podcast episodes. The first was the most recent episode we released, which was with Kate Atwood, and she talked about some of her mentors, Kat Cole and Hala Modelmog. And then also I recorded I've got a Spun Mafia series, as you know, which is talking about my first company, Spun Logic, but I had as guests 4 mentors that were on the advisory board of that company when we were, in our 20s. And anyway, so I've been thinking a lot about, mentorship and people who, sort of help you along the way. And I realized, I don't know that I've ever asked you that in your career, sort of in your life. I'm guessing there have to have been people who have helped you and guided you, right?
Well, yeah, there definitely has. And just kind of getting into that, when you say mentor, is it like, or you talk about the people who helped you? Is this a formal relationship you had with them? Like you shall be my mentor and I shall be your mentee. Or when you say mentor, is it something that when you look back, you're like, they played a big role? How do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's definitely been plenty of formalized mentorship that I've been the recipient of. But certainly, like growing up playing tennis, there were a couple of coaches that I look back now and realize they were as impactful as any formal mentor, right?
Yeah.
But yes, no, I was lucky enough to have early on in my career a couple of people that after having a couple meetings with them to get advice, basically I asked them, would you be a mentor to me? Could we meet quarterly? And you know what? They all said yes. So I'm super lucky from that perspective.
Yeah, and which I think is good, and it's interesting because it's always been a challenge, in my in definitely my corporate life around this mentoring program. And there's always companies that want to implement a mentoring program. One of the biggest challenges has always been about sometimes if you formalize it so much, it's ineffective, right? Because it's an expectation versus a desire.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, but I would say that my mentors. So first, I was probably really bad about it. Seeking it out deliberately because I don't know, maybe a stubbornness of I shall figure it out on my own, or something, or maybe just a fear of asking. But I definitely I would say I've had mentors who's directly impacted me. I don't know if there's ever anyone where, other than when I was in college and I was in this internship program called Inroads. And I had a formal mentor-mentee relationship with an executive in the company I was mentoring in. And to show you how effective that could maybe remember the name of the person, but that's an example of that formality. But what I do remember, and I think this is where I've always been able to work with people that I've respected so much, where a lot of the CEOs I've worked for have, when I look back now, and even the toughest times when they're frankly kicking my ass, have been some of the best mentoring times, and I'm a better leader for it. And I realize that I have a really friendly relationship with them, and I'm like, oh, that's a good mentoring relationship. So they have those who are kind of that one-to-one. And then I've had some relationships where it's kind of a little bit more of a distance, and almost what I call an influencer mentor. And I mentioned Beth Comstock all the time, where even though we did not have that one-to-one relationship all the time, other than some occasional meetings, her sphere of thinking shaped mine. So yeah, definitely throughout the years, I've had kind of a wide range of kind of mentoring type relationships.
At any of the large companies that you worked at, was that a function? Like, I know people who work at Coca-Cola as an example, and as you sort of rise in leadership, in many departments, there's an actual process for, okay, this person's going to be your mentor for the next year or whatever the period is. Did you ever have that?
Yeah, I mean, I was actually on the side of becoming a mentor for others on that, and and it's going back to what I mentioned before. I'm always nervous about those because of if it is not set up, it's you just be spinning wheels, right? And but yeah, I've been part of them, and some of those matchups have been really good. Um, but I think that some of the best mentoring I've seen, whether it's with me or others, have been ones that you don't even realize you're in a mentoring relationship to, and you step back and realize, wow, this person really has been huge. I mean, I'll go back to when I was during my times at Equifax, when I rose to running a business unit, and that's publicly reported, and had revenue and sale, all that type of stuff coming to it. One of my there was a peer general manager, president, who really, we had a good relationship, and when my prior role, I really worked well with him. And when I went into this role, he just took it upon himself to kind of reach out and help, and especially on a lot of the stuff around sales and incentives and the targets and all that. And because he was what I call one of these gritty GMs, right? He knows how to really run a business and a quarterly business. And even at that moment, I remember thinking back and thinking about, like, I would have called him a mentor, even though we never used that term in our relationship at all.
Yep.
And to this day, I look back even at lessons I've learned from him as a result of that relationship we had at that time.
I would say, it's interesting you say that, because I have also, I feel like Hala, for me, has been a mentor. Maybe she sort of knows it, maybe she sort of doesn't. Like, we've never had that conversation, but I've sought out ways to, sort of absorb some of her lessons. I actually had her give a talk to my leadership team at one point. I would say, honestly, selfishly, as much for me to learn from her as my leadership team, but as she was running the chamber, and watching her lead and seeing her guide conversations, so I think it's, it can be very formal, or it can be informal. But I think the idea that, people have, at least for me, and again, I have a different experience than you. I was 21 years old trying to start a company. Right. So I was always seeking, because I've had this, even today, a bit of an imposter syndrome, where I'm constantly doing things that I've never done before. And I'm like, this is definitely something I don't have experience in. And so looking to others, that's why I read so many books, because I'm trying to draw insights. But I mean, honestly, like the people who've stepped up, Ken Bernhardt very specifically, from an early, maybe I was 26 until continuing today, has always been there and supported me. One of the things I love about Ken, and I think it makes a successful mentor-mentee relationship, is honesty. Ken will listen. Ken cares about me, but he will also tell me when I'm just way off, or hit me in the face with what's so obvious, but I somehow can't see it. It's almost like therapy sometimes. So that honesty, I think, is critical.
And that is key. And I think this is where, and sometimes in some of the programs that are formalized, I'm not saying they don't work, and I think they're important. And I think they're super valuable, particularly when you are in these kind of younger, earlier career programs, and you can do some matchups. And sometimes it's for that networking for career advancement. But I think one of the challenges with some of those programs is, you gotta have credibility on both sides and earn that honesty between people,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it's that trust, that those intangible things that happen. um and um and so yeah, I think that's essential, because if I look back at the people who's really, like I mentioned before, I didn't even realize it was a mentoring relationship. I viewed them as a mentor or influence, on my career or my life. That trust aspect was there, and that honest feedback was there, like, you're crazy for doing this. But I will tell you though, Jeff, I think a good mentor also um helps you support through that imposter syndrome, because I think that imposter syndrome is, which I feel every day of my life. But I think it's it's that thing that for some people, you're at the bleeding edge of what you do or want to do. And I think a good mentor nurtures that, so you don't feel like an imposter, and you just
Mm-hmm.
feel like you're breaking ground. Because I think it's also I think a mentor could also potentially hold you back and go, well, this is the way it's always done. And there's a difference line. Here's things you should do or think about doing versus this is the way it's always done, because you need to let people have their own path as well.
No, totally. Yeah. And it's interesting too, because I think that there's probably, I would guess in most cases, there needs to be maybe a limited time of the relationship where there's a year commitment or a 2 year commitment. I say that knowing that, Ken has been a mentor of
Yeah.
mine for, going on 15 plus years, and I hope that he is for the next 15 years. But I also think there's, for most mentors, there probably is a period where it's like, all right, I've helped you, but it's time for you sort of to go and maybe seek other experience. And so, um, I think like what's been amazing to me is there are a couple of the most successful startups in Atlanta that have 300 people.
Yeah.
They've been just doing amazing things that you and I both know, and the CEOs of each of those companies have a mentor that they
Yep.
meet with regularly. And so it doesn't matter where you are in the cycle, whether you're just starting off at a large corporation, you're just starting your company and you're a young person, or you're 40 years old and have a 300-person company. Having somebody give you advice, have a little bit of an outside perspective, that I mean, that is so critical and important.
Well, and I think that gets into that whole aspect is mentoring, coaching, mentoring. And I mean, mentoring is part of coaching, right? And it's just a probably more formalized relationship or informal relationship that lets you do that.
Mhm.
And I do think there is incredible value, and especially as people get more and more senior, that coaching aspect. And frankly, I think that's a trap I kind of fell into, to a
Yep.
point where, as I got into very senior roles very early, relatively speaking, in my kind of career cycle, right? So I was always younger for what probably should have been the role.
Yep.
And so there's always this fear of, to me it was almost like, well, I can't let anybody do I how can someone be coaching me? Then as I started interacting with folks, like this gentleman, Rudy, who really was huge in helping become a general manager. And I would call him today, even though we haven't talked in forever. I would call him today and trust every ounce of information he would give me. So to me, I
Mhm.
think those relationships can last. But I think it's also important, whether it's you're early in your life, but even if you get more senior, on this aspect of getting coached, and not in a kind of cheesy, what infomercial way, but
Mhm.
just in a way that's, and sometimes it could be holistic, and sometimes, because I think some of these folks that you talk about, entrepreneurs, or who are in their 40s and have huge organizations and are getting coached, that whole thing you talked about, imposter syndrome, could probably be recast different ways. And leadership, and this gets back to Jeff, when I formed this whole concept of high wire and kind of peer-to-peer coaching and all that, this concept of, as you get more senior and you start driving more change, it is very lonely.
Mhm.
And so to have, whether it's a mentor or whatever, that relationship is so essential, because it kind of keeps your head on straight, that
Yes.
it is okay to do what I do. And also realizing that you start getting a lot of false narratives for feedback from your own staff. And so to have someone who could help give you perspective on, some truth, I think is important.
Yeah, that's huge. And coaching, I think, is the exact way to look at it. I also think that's, by the way, the biggest role of leader and
Yeah.
leadership, right, is coaching. I think of like, and we should talk a little bit about where you and I both find ourselves now, which is also being a mentor or a
Mm-hmm.
coach. But I think about like specifically in tennis, which was my sport growing up. The coach can prepare you for the match, but once the match starts, you're there. There's no coaching going on. So this idea that like you're trying to impart advice or sort of or a process for them to be successful, but once you're done with that session, whatever that session is, then for the next week or two, they're in the match, they're in the game, they have to
Yeah.
be doing the thing. So it definitely to me is coaching. Now I know that with all the things you're involved in, you find yourself at a minimum, I know, giving advice one-on-one once,
Yeah.
but do you find yourself sort of in a position where you're the coach more often?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, for some of it, sometimes even more formalized. I mean, there's in terms of like not as much lately, but the big part of you know my world was really building formalized relationships particularly with executives who are at the tip of the spear of change, and coaching
Mhm.
them through that, because that's where to me it gets really lonely. And that's for me where as you know, is my passion, right? The whole concept of things like Disruptor Studio and innovation and all that, to me, is not about tech, it's about change leadership. And
Yes.
so I love because when I thought it was going to go into consulting at one point. It really was about coaching and coaching executives to be on that lonely branch out there,
Mm.
um, to lead change. And they usually tended to be C-suite and sometimes CEO, sometimes C-suite, and helping them get through kind of that whole change process in their organization. So that is kind of my passion and love to do. So that's a little bit more formalized, and there's a model around all that. But yeah, then definitely there's I finding myself what's kind of been great lately, and I just get energy out of it, is also that one-to-one, even if it's one-off here and there.
Hmm.
Even though I'm not, I mean, I do have entrepreneurship now, but not, I've not had 20, 30 years of it. But as young entrepreneurs come up looking for advice or coaching or connectivity, that's been a big part of it, or other executives. So I'm always finding myself, whether it's a one-to-one or a one-off thing,
Hmm.
doing it, but I love doing it as well too.
Yeah.
How
And
about you? I'm sure you're seeing that as well.
yeah, no, I mean, I think it's why I started Ripples of Hope last year,
Mm,
which is a
that's right.
nonprofit that um, essentially is there to mentor and coach nonprofit leaders to be successful CEOs and to grow their companies. To me, it's a really you and I, being from whether it's entrepreneurship or corporate success, are wired to look for advice
Right.
and to make those connections. What I find on the nonprofit and the social side of things is that these people have started to run a company or started a company because they have a passion for changing the world, but they're not necessarily business people. They're not necessarily studying leadership. They're studying, poverty or
Yeah,
homelessness,
exactly.
right? And so what I've found is that what I get certainly as a mentor much more out of helping guide nonprofit leaders. Number one, because again, they're not getting a lot of that nourishment. But number two, because gosh, if they have any success from what I've shared, the world is a better place. And
Yeah.
so I've over the last call it 5 years shifted from mentoring, a lot of young, call them, tech startup entrepreneurs to almost exclusively mentoring nonprofit leaders because I think that's where the biggest need from my skill set is around building a company from something small, and I think it makes the bigger impact.
And part of it, imagine when you're doing that, and the sort of mentoring or coaching one of those leaders need ranges from, there's the pragmatic, right? Because you talk about, particularly for nonprofits or passionate in terms of, I'm going to solve, I'm here to
Mhm.
solve issues around poverty or whatever it is. And so there's that fundamental aspect of how you kind of run a business to be able to do that. There's that coaching to do that, but then there's also that, coaching and mentoring of giving them confidence that, and I love what you said before. I'm going to keep going back to it, is to get through imposter syndrome, because I'm sure
Yep.
I think any good change leader of the civil change should find themselves at that point. But it's also, I think, part of good mentoring and coaching is also not getting beyond your skis. So you have a role to play, and I am not going to pretend to all of a sudden become a tax expert or something, in terms
Right.
of structure, but telling them that you really need to talk about X. And I've had that before, particularly with younger companies,
Hmm.
where they're like talking about this. And I'm like, look, I'm not going to pretend to be a legal expert on this. And that to me is just not what mentoring is. That's just giving
That's right.
advice. But I think a mistake would be to feel like you have to know everything when you're mentoring somebody or coaching somebody, but understanding when you have to give them outlets to access.
There's a philosophy on sort of advice and sharing advice. I want to say it's got something to do with Benjamin Franklin, but the idea is
Mm-hmm.
like you share experience. So if someone says,
Yeah.
"Hey, I've got this problem," rather than saying, "Well, here's a possible solution," you force yourself to say, "Well, here's an experience I've had that may or
Right.
may not be helpful."
Right.
And I think, when I think about mentorship, it's being a good listener, because oftentimes
Yep.
the answer is inside of the leader anyway.
Absolutely.
They just need to get it out. But then also, to your point, I'm so careful these days about not trying to answer it, but guide them by things that I've experienced. Again, you could even point back to a book and say, well, there's this philosophy in this book that I read. But I
Right.
think giving them tools to
Right.
allow them to go off and make the decision, and letting them know, look, it's fine. Whatever direction you go, I'm just here to give advice, that they know that they don't have to take what you're telling them and run with it. I think that's a healthy relationship. One of the things when we did the Spun Mafia recording with my old advisory board is, and I didn't realize we were doing this, but they said, look, you guys would start, we had quarterly meetings, and they said you would start every quarterly meeting reminding us of the advice that we had given you. And then in the last meeting, and telling us whether or not you acted on it and why.
Hmm.
And I don't remember because this was 15 years ago, but my guess is maybe Ken or Bill Nussey, who were sort of the two leaders of the advisory board, they might have told us to do that and then forgotten that they told us.
Right.
They were like, "You guys were so great about that,"
Yeah.
but this idea that we would start and say, "Okay, remember we were focused on this decision. You guys told us this," and they said sometimes we'd say, "We didn't do that, and here's why." And they
Right.
just really respected that, and I think that sets the stage for a good, again, that good coach player relationship.
Well, and one of the things too. So I 100% agree with you is about that listening and giving kind of framing, because and I so agree with you in terms of the answers usually from within, and that's what you need to bring out too, because you're not in that role, whatever that role they're in as a mentor, right? You're there to give them
Yep.
some level of confidence or push or whatever. But one thing that I'll mention too, that I think that gets perceived incorrectly, is that mentor-mentee relationship is always someone who's more senior to someone more junior, and I think some of the most powerful, and I know for me some of the best mentoring I've received, um, or advice, has been through kind of peers, or perceive whatever peers mean, or even someone who's maybe even more junior than you in the traditional sense of relationships, of business relationships. And I think opening yourself up, that some of your best advice comes from those that you deal with every day. And by the way, that's probably even greater trust factors,
Hmm.
because and that I think is important if you're within a big company too, where sometimes when you're set up, this is where sometimes it gets challenging in a big company, where it's like, you're going to have the C level or SVP of so and so be your mentor, you're also thinking about career management to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
But to have someone that's maybe a peer or have someone that's outside of your realm, I think is important. You and I have had a great relationship for years where we've never called a mentor, mentee in any dimension, but I know I've learned a lot from you.
Certainly back.
I know you've learned nothing from me, but that's okay. I'll
I've
extract
learned a
it.
lot what not to do.
Exactly. So
No, I was going to say the same thing with, I think we're that type of relationship. We have different experiences. We're working on projects together, obviously. And I am absolutely on the same page. I've learned things from you and I do things that I've seen you do. And again, that can be just part of a healthy, trusting relationship as well.
and that's one of the things that you and I both do, and I continue to do is even organizing gatherings of kind of perceived peer groups, so
Yep.
they could mentor each other. And one of the most valuable, and Jeff, some of the stuff we've done in these kind of gatherings, and one of them. Just the other day, I've learned about a relationship that formed at one of those convenings
Yep.
that I put together that continues to actually be a true mentor-mentee relationship. I had no idea, but I just loved it because that's the whole idea behind it. Because that peer network, but then finding that relationship that I could click with for whatever it is that you're dealing with in life, that I think is pretty powerful too. So.
Agreed.
Well, good. Well, Jeff, this is another great discussion. So I will continue to give you advice that you should not listen to, and continue to do that. But no, this is good. So look forward to having. I'm sure we'll have more discussions around this concept because we could go on and talk about networks and all kinds of stuff in terms of this topic as well too. But I do want to thank everybody for listening to us here on the Jeff and Alex podcast. And Jeff, actually, before we go here, you have had some podcasts kind of related to this topic.
Mm-hmm.
I want to give that a plug.
Yeah, absolutely. On my Begin the Begin podcast, not only did I have the Spun Mafia Advisory Board, but I also had a couple of Atlanta Tech Village mentors give advice and stuff. So, you guys can check that out for some more tidbits.
Yeah, and one thing I'll also encourage too, and then on my Disruptive Studio podcast series too, we at some point during those conversations, we tend to have some element of who influences you, and kind of that mentoring or where they've gotten support. So this essence is really kind of the fabric, I think, of a lot of these leaders and change leaders that Jeff and I get to interact with. So thank you everybody for joining us. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube to get notified for our weekly Jeff and Alex podcast series, and also subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. And we actually encourage you to do both and engage with Jeff and I on social media. And let's keep the conversation going and have a chat about this topic or any others. So thanks for listening to the Jeff and Alex podcast, and we will see you, Jeff, in about a week.
See you then.